But anyways, I'm just saying we need to be conscious. It's a conscious effort.
It's a conscious effort. It's constant work to have the intellectual humility to say, I may be feel very convicted on this issue, but I still have something to learn from everyone, right? And to be able to have civil dialogue and civil conversation with people with whom I have profound disagreements, because there's going to be something that I can learn from that person. They may not persuade me to go over to their other side on this or that issue, but they do have something meaningful to say. And I have something meaningful to say to them as well. And, you talked about the effects of lockdowns and social distancing, which is a very interesting term if you think about it. A more medical term would have been physical distancing, but social distancing. It reminds me, there was a 20th century Jewish philosopher named Hannah Arendt who published a very famous book now called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And one of the things that she looked at, this was, published after World War II, but looking at Nazism, Italian fascism, Soviet communism. She said one of the preconditions for a totalitarian system to take hold in a society is what she called organized loneliness. And it seems to me that with lockdowns, school closures, and social distancing, we had the most profound form of organized loneliness that has ever been accomplished in human history globally. And that's scary. Another important political philosopher of the 20th century also studied the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, a man named Eric Voegelin. He said the common feature of all totalitarian systems is not mass surveillance, which we have in the United States, by the way. I don't know if you saw what happened in Congress this week, but it's not concentration camps and secret police, men in jackboots and barbed wire fences. He said, as horrifying as all those things are, the starting point and the common feature of all totalitarian systems is the prohibition of questions. The regime monopolizes what counts as knowledge, what counts as rationality. And if you raise your hand and ask any inconvenient questions about that, like, is it really a good idea to close all the schools, even though children are at low risk from COVID? Or how do we know that this novel technology has been adequately tested in human population, or whatever? You just, the regime does not sit down and debate with you. Oh, why do you think that? Oh, let me present my reasons for thinking the contrary. They simply, for the Nazi, or you're just infected with Jew consciousness. For the Soviet, you're just infected with bourgeois consciousness. You're obviously not within the realm of polite, rational conversation. We're going to exclude you, and we're going to shut you up. And if you don't shut up, then we'll lock you up, right? That's sort of the next step. And the other thing that he and Arendt both pointed out about a system like this is that initially you need those external punishments. You need the secret police and the concentration camps and the kind of external forms of punishment. But in a perfectly realized totalitarian society, you actually have to imprison far fewer people. You have to surveil far fewer people, because everyone becomes a potential informant. Everyone is surveilling everyone else all the time. As the ideology is internalized, people start self-censoring. And then the end point of that process, they're self-censoring without even realizing that they're self-censoring. So you're in a prison where you don't realize you're in a prison and you can't see the bars. And that's the most perfectly realized form of totalitarianism. Absolutely. And so I mean, that's a long-winded, somewhat
it's not
digression, but my point is, why is censorship so important? Right? Why is the ability to pose inconvenient questions, the ability even to be wrong? I mean, we have the right to be wrong. We have the right to conjecture something and hypothesize something and then later change our mind. And well, no, it didn't pan out that way. If you're not able to do that, you're headed for a real nightmare of a society.
Right. I mean, your lawsuit is fighting two things that people need to draw from that answer. Is one, we are facing a totalitarian regime. That is who we have in government. Anybody who is attempting to do what Aaron and his colleagues now have proof of is a totalitarian form of government. Number one. Number two, your lawsuit is exposing that and trying to prevent that. But the first realization, because people, and this is not a political, I say it all the time. I've never voted for Trump. This is not an endorsement of Trump, but just so people understand, they have always accused him of being an authoritarian, totalitarian candidate. Regardless of whether he is or he is not, I don't know. But certainly who is in office right now, who is overseeing the White House, the CDC, CISA, the NIH, all of these organizations is a totalitarian leader. So people need to get on board with that, and that's really important. So let me
tell you about.
Go ahead, go.
Yeah, so
go for it, Aaron. This is your day. This is your platform. Let's do it.
I often ask people how many three-letter federal agencies they can name, right? And a really well-informed American can maybe name a dozen. Okay, well, there's the CDC, the FDA, the FBI, the CIA. I could probably rattle off a few more if I stopped and thought about it. The Department of Defense, the Department of this, Department of that. And then I asked them, do you know how many federal agencies there are total that your taxpayer dollars are funding? And the answer is there are 434, most of which most Americans have never heard of, obviously. Right. Well, one of those agencies that most Americans have never heard of, fairly new, it was conceived in the waning days of the Obama administration in 2016. It was finally approved and funded by Congress in 2018. So it hasn't been around for very long. And CISA stands for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, a brilliant government acronym that has the same word in it twice, just in case you wondered what they were about.
Super
and they're
efficient.
Supposedly, yes, exactly, supposedly set up to protect our digital infrastructure and our critical infrastructure from things like cyber attacks or other forms of sabotage, computer viruses and so forth. Protect the grid so that nefarious foreign actors don't try to take us down. Well, most Americans, I think, have some notion of what our digital infrastructure is and what our critical infrastructure is. In 2017, the first director of CISA, Jen Easterly, who's one of the defendants in our case, said, well, part of protecting our critical infrastructure is protecting our election infrastructure. And CISA stepped in to take control at the federal level of election integrity, which has traditionally and constitutionally been a state by state issue. The states are responsible for elections. And then she went a step further and said, and part of our election infrastructure is our cognitive infrastructure. So CISA needs to be protecting our cognitive infrastructure. Now, our listeners may be thinking, well, I think I kind of know what our digital infrastructure is. And I sort of probably know what our election infrastructure is, like make sure the voting machines aren't hacked or something like that. But what's our cognitive infrastructure? In the queen of all government euphemisms, our cognitive infrastructure is literally the thoughts inside of your head. Yeah. So CISA very quickly pivoted to censorship, and they became the central clearinghouse, the nerve center of the government censorship apparatus, through which these government cutouts, the quasi-private entities I mentioned earlier, and other federal agencies fund their censorship demands to the social media companies. And so here you have a new government agency that, under the guise of cybersecurity, has been literally not just protecting you online from computer viruses, but controlling the flow of information online. And to really wrap your head around everything that's happened in the 4 years when it comes to censorship, once you kind of peel back the carpet and see what's underneath, it's quite shocking to realize that basically everything all the information that I've found online over the last 4 years has to a large extent been curated by the government, not even by the private companies. And, we could debate about issues with the private companies censoring, but even just bracket that for a moment, been curated by the government. That's not a society that I want to live in. I mean, no. it's very, very serious. And so people might think, well, you guys are talking about totalitarianism. That sounds overblown.